Welcome to episode 321 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to, once again, retired agent Frank Figliuzzi, who served in the FBI for 25 years. In this episode, he reviews the FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative, a special unit that tracks the victims of serial murderers picked up at truck stops in one jurisdiction, sexually assaulted and murdered in another, and dumped along a highway in a third place. Frank shares how the transient nature of the offenders and the multiple jurisdictions involved make these cases incredibly difficult to solve. Frank shares his journey to learn more about the victims and better understand the life of a trucker in his new book, Long Haul: Hunting the Highway Serial Killers. During his career, Frank held senior FBI leadership positions. His FBI career highlights include leading the FBI's efforts to counter economic espionage in Silicon Valley, California, overseeing major financial crimes and public corruption investigations in Miami, Florida, and Cleveland, Ohio, directing an FBI internal disciplinary unit in the Office of Professional Responsibility, OPR, and as a chief inspector overseeing sensitive internal inquiries, shooting reviews, and performance audits. Frank's last assignment before retiring from the FBI was as Assistant Director for Counterintelligence. Currently, Frank is a respected national security analyst, appearing weekly on live television for NBC and MSNBC News, and is a sought-after speaker, panelist, and instructor on national security and leadership. You can find more about Frank and his book, Long Haul: Hunting the Highway Serial Killers, at frankfigliuzzi.com. Frank was previously a guest on FBI Retired Case File Review, episode 228, discussing national security and his book, The FBI Way. Before we get to the case review, I want to remind you to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on whatever platform you get your podcast. My preference is to put out episodes every other week, but lately I've been posting shows 3 to 4 times a month, and I don't want you to miss any of them. The next episode will be released 2 weeks from now, but I will have shows for you every week in the month of July. So yeah, please follow the show on your favorite podcast app and follow me, Jerry Williams, on social media so you'll know when a new show is posted. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find links to where you can join my reader team to keep up with the FBI and books, TV, and movies, buy me a cup of coffee, and learn more about me and my nonfiction book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, and my 2 FBI crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers, all available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Plus, there's my FBI word search puzzle book, Fun for Armchair Detectives. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest back again, Frank Figliuzzi. Hey, Frank, how are you?
I'm great, Jerry. I'm glad we could do this. Last time we did this, I had a book out, The FBI Way, and here we are again with another book coming out.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, the last time you were here, we recorded episode 228, which was all about national security and your book, The FBI Way. This time, we're talking about a whole different topic. I know that you spent a lot of your career doing counterintelligence, so you have got to let us know what made you interested in this highway serial killers, the topic of your new book, Long Haul: Hunting the Highway Serial Killers.
Yeah, Jerry, you are indeed right. This is different for me. You are correct. I was kind of a specialist in the FBI in counterintelligence. I had worked it as a street agent. I had worked as a supervisor in counterintelligence in the San Francisco division, and ultimately ended up as assistant director over the counterintelligence program. So this is very different for me, and it will be for many Americans generally. I have to confess that despite 25 years in the FBI, I had never heard of the Highway Serial Killings Initiative, which is what Long Haul is all about. It's a very specialized program within the FBI's behavioral analysis units. We'll talk about that. How did I get interested? Well, a few years ago, I'm doing a podcast of my own, and I happened to interview the criminal analyst at Quantico in Behavioral Analysis Unit 4, who says, when I ask her a very simple question, tell me what you do at the FBI, she says, well, I head up the Highway Serial Killings Initiative. And I said, look, I've got to tell you, I don't know anything about that. What is that? And she said, well, we have over 850 murders in a special database called the Highway Serial Killings Database. It sits within VICAP, which is the large violent criminal apprehension program database that the FBI has. We help connect the dots for police departments across the country, looking at unsolved murders, largely of sex-trafficked women, along the nation's highways, that we are convinced are linked to long-haul truckers. That began my journey, both literally and figuratively, because it was a journey because I rode over 2,000 miles with a big rig trucker to take a very deep dive into three cultures: the trucking culture, the sex-trafficked victim culture, and the crime analyst culture, the people who try to connect the dots and stop the killing.
This is something we are hearing a lot about. So what we're going to talk about today is all of that, but focus more on what happens on our highways and a little bit also about the VICAP initiative. So why don't you tell us about your whole journey out there on the highways and a couple of the stories that you may have heard while you were out there riding on the long haul?
Yeah, of course. When I was SAC Cleveland, and now we're talking 2006 to 2010, one of the very first briefings I got was from the supervisors in the Toledo resident agency. At that time, it was a two-squad agency. There was a criminal squad and there was a national security squad. And the criminal supervisor briefed me on something I had known nothing about, which is that Toledo was indeed a hub for sex trafficking, particularly to truckers, because it's a trucking hub with interstate highways that intersect, particularly in and out of Detroit. A real trucking center, a major bus center. It's also a port. So he briefed me that there was a real problem with sex trafficking and pimp-controlled trafficking nationally, not just locally, not just regionally, but nationally. He had developed some cases involving trafficking to the Super Bowl out of the Toledo area and was really working closely with the sheriff's office and the local police department to kind of tackle this problem holistically. He got some grant money to do this. Toledo became a major player in the FBI's Innocence Lost project, which has to do with the interstate trafficking of minors. I want to really give credit to a Toledo-based professor at the University of Toledo. Her name is Dr. Celia Williamson. She actually received the FBI Director's Community Leadership Award in 2009 for the work she was doing at a street level with the sex trade and the police departments. And we nominated her for the Director's Award, and she got it. She had an organization at the time called Second Chance. It's now called RISE. And what they were all about was giving young women and girls an alternative to sex trafficking. Let me tell you something. There was really impressive work being done by the FBI Cleveland victim witness specialists. I can't say enough good things about the FBI's victim witness program, but what many people may not know is that they absolutely get involved in victims who have been sex trafficked. What's that all about? It means that in this day and age, as Professor Williamson will tell you, it isn't about arresting these women and young girls and treating them as criminals, but rather treating them as victims and giving them a chance to get out. And that means coming alongside them and working with the police and sheriffs to think differently about this problem and view it as victimization. The FBI victim specialists, who were female at the time that were specializing in this, would come alongside these victims when they were confronted by police for soliciting sex and say, what do you need to get out of this? We're not arresting you. We're asking you a question. What do you need to get out of this? And that started these women talking and saying, well, actually, I've got a baby at home and I need diapers. I need a roof over my head. I'm going to get killed if I leave my pimp. We would work with Dr. Williamson's organization, who would then say, we have that for you. We have the vouchers for food and baby formula and diapers. We have someone willing to put a roof over your head. We have training available to get you that certificate you need to do whatever it is that you're close to doing or want to do with your life. And that was phenomenal. That's what got the director's attention with regard to Second Chance, and that led to the award.
Well, this is really fascinating because I think most of us don't think about the women that are trafficked in connection with serial killers. And really, when you're talking about this highway initiative, it's making that connection. I think I get it, but why don't you explain to us why these particular women are victim to this?
Yeah, absolutely. These are among the most vulnerable people in our society. When I talk to the experts like Dr. Williamson and a doctor at Arizona State University named Dr. Rose Sepowitz, who also runs a fascinating program for young women who have small children who are coming out of the sex trade. I learned a lot here. And one of the things I learned is the vulnerability involves young women, although there are also trans people who are victimized and boys as well. The majority are young women who have experienced often severe trauma in their lives, often preteen trauma, often of a sexual nature. They've often been involved in drug use early on, often starting with marijuana. Many of these women told me, this may not be popular, that marijuana was their gateway drug to more serious drugs, often including opioids and heroin. And so you now have this perfect storm of trauma that leads them often to have a series of bad boyfriends, get in with the proverbial wrong crowd, and often get recruited, even before they realize it. They are recruited into selling their bodies, often figuring, as one woman told me, hey, I was having sex already. Why not get paid for it? And why not help my boyfriend out? So-called boyfriend. Many of these women think their pimps are somehow their saviors, their boyfriends. They think there's genuine love there. There's not. And I get deep into that dynamic in the book. Dr. Rose Sepowitz at Arizona State has recognized a real vulnerable group, which is that there's a commonality here. And it's important for us to talk about commonalities. That's what the FBI behavioral analysts tell me is so important. Commonalities among the killer truckers and commonalities among the victims are the key to figuring out the crime. But one commonality early on that can almost predict certain behaviors and outcomes is not only the trauma in early life, the early drug use, the series of bad boyfriends, an unstable family life, but kids that have learning difficulties are in often called special ed programs. Those kids are particularly vulnerable. The program at ASU goes into at-risk classrooms and trains those special ed teachers to talk to kids and identify the early warning signs.
All right. So we have these vulnerable women, boys, trans women that are out there working in the sex industry. But for them, some of the dangers that we normally would think about are even more horrific. Talk a little bit more about the serial killer aspect, which is where you've decided to focus your research and trying to learn more about long-haul truckers and their connection to this vulnerable community.
Absolutely. It was truly an eye-opening experience, both from the victim side and from the trucker side as I dove into this. I don't cry very easily. We've all seen very horrific things in our FBI careers. But as I interviewed one victim who survived encounters with truckers, she began sobbing. I began tearing up with the horror of the abuses that she has experienced. We are talking about women who have been raped multiple times, often by their pimps, not to mention their clients, often while under the effects of strong drugs, often suffering mental illness issues. And it's just horrific. Some of the horror comes from the worst truckers that have killed multiple times. And by the way, the FBI says at any given time, they're looking at 450 suspects among the long-haul trucking community. I came across infamous truckers like Robert Ben Rhodes, who is believed to have killed as many as 50 victims. Truckers who set up traveling torture chambers within their rig, in their tractor trailer, shackling women to the ceiling inside their rig in the sleeper berth. The book starts out with a story of an Arizona state trooper who pulled over a big rig, only to find a screaming naked woman shackled in a torture chamber in the rig. He had pulled over unknowingly Robert Ben Rhodes, believed to have committed 50 murders. The FBI came in a big way with Robert Ben Rhodes because his final victim, Regina Walters, her body was discovered decomposing in an abandoned farmhouse in Illinois. She had been raped, beaten, tortured with fish hooks, her flesh ripped open. Her last photograph taken by Rhodes depicted her begging, pleading Rhodes not to kill her. It's a ghastly image to look at when you know what she's going through. I came across other killers like Timothy Velifides, known as the vampire killer, who would use power tools to grind down his victims' teeth into fangs. He wore fangs himself. He kept women in his truck. The beatings, the rapes are just horrific. The Behavioral Analysis Unit tells me that, and the head of this initiative, by the way, who's been the head of the Highway Serial Killings Initiative for 17 years, tells me there are two kinds of serial trucker killers. One is all about power and control. They love the idea of controlling life and death, and these killers take their time torturing, inflicting pain on their victims. They like that power and control. And they have sex often repeatedly, sometimes pre-death, sometimes post-mortem with their victims. And the second category they tell me about, and I write about in the book, is the killer who's really all about the killing. They don't want to have sex. It's not of interest to them. They simply kill quickly for the joy of it. All of that comes into the FBI's radar screen when they're looking at a crime scene. Not only who did this, but who was the victim. And that gets into, Jerry, the whole topic of what's called victimology, the study of the victims chosen and the way they dress, where they come from, what hair color they might have. I looked at a case called the Redhead Killings. It's a famous series of murders. All the victims had red hair, all very petite women. It's never truly been solved. Some of the murders, as many as 10 or more, have been solved, but some have not been solved. When you're looking at the fact that 25 killers, truckers, are currently in prison for multiple murders, you realize that the cases are still not solved. The numbers are still going up.
Why truckers? We all do a lot of driving, and now every time that a tractor trailer passes by, we're all going to be wondering what's inside, what's going on. Why truckers, and what is it that makes truckers involved in serial murders? And are we talking about all truckers? I hope not.
Yeah, no, and I know that's not the case. And in fact, the trucker that I rode with, I think represents the future of young people and trucking, high-tech trucking. Trucking's become quite high-tech now and complicated. The salaries can be quite good, six-figure salaries. And I go out of my way to explain in the book that the vast majority of truckers not only are a national asset, we seldom realize how much our economy relies on trucking, but these are often men and women who feed their families, have kids, law-abiding, never commit a crime. That's 99.9%. But that leaves enough, because of the millions of commercial driver's licenses out there, that leaves enough men, almost always men, to really wreak havoc on the highways. But I do dedicate the book in part to the stalwart American trucker who puts the food on our tables. We can't survive without truckers. But here's the thing. It's often the old nature or nurture argument or chicken or the egg debate, which is, does the trucking lifestyle create a killer? Or is it that people who have that propensity are attracted to the life of a long-haul trucker? Endless weeks and months on the road, almost always in isolation, really being in charge of your own schedule. You do have to get places, of course, on time, but I dig deep into this question, the psychology question. I cite in the book a study out of Canada on the health of long-haul truckers, and it's really depressing. Depression is part of the life, by the way. If you don't have mental issues before a career in long-haul trucking, you may end up with some. because of the abysmal diet that truckers have, the sedentary nature of their life, the lack of interaction. They get even more detailed, Jerry, because I talk about the different kinds of trucking. So, for example, I rode along with a long-haul flatbed trucker. What does that mean? It means that he has a lot more engagement and mental work that he has to do. He has to properly load and secure a load. He has to know how to work the straps and the chains and what the points of securement are and the federal requirements for that. He has to understand the weights and distribution over his axles. Lots of engagement with where he's picking the load up from and where he's dropping off. It's very physical. The loading of the truck is him, often arduous physical labor. That's all a good thing as I see it. And then on the other end of the spectrum, what they call the dry vanners, the guys who are loading up boxes of Kleenex or salsa and transporting that. No interaction with anybody other than opening the door and closing it when they show up or drop off. Those are different personality types there. These killers, the FBI tells us, exploit the seams in police jurisdictions very well. That means that they'll grab a victim in one jurisdiction, they may rape or kill her in a second jurisdiction, and they'll dump the body in a third jurisdiction. That's really wreaking havoc with police work. That's where the FBI comes in. Because often these sheriff's departments, these state patrols, they're not talking to each other. And the dots have to be connected by somebody. And that's where the FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative comes in.
I forgot to mention that I have done an episode way back in 2019. It was episode 176 with Michael Harrigan, who at one time during his career was the unit chief of the Highway Serial Killing Initiative, or VICAP, I'm not sure which one. But what you're able to bring to this particular episode is an update because, again, that was a while back that I spoke to him. And I think that there has even been more work on this particular initiative, trying to get more police departments involved in the program. I know in your book, you talk about some of the issues that the Bureau is trying to overcome and getting them to be a part of it and to update and to upload their information.
Yeah, I mean, this is the old garbage in, garbage out problem, meaning that many of the police departments out there don't have the time, money, or resources to literally ask the FBI to help. Meaning there's these long forms that have to be filled out in the VICAP program, but particularly in the Highway Serial Killings Initiative, about your crime scene, your suspects, your victims. And I mean hundreds of questions. How was the body positioned? Was she in water or not? Was she dressed or not, or partially dressed? Was she sexually abused or not? Was she taped? Where was she taped? Mouth, wrists, legs. All of this, if you simply, and I say simply almost in quotes, fill out those answers, you may find that the FBI can tell you who did it. But that seemingly simple act of filling out that data, entering that data, is arduous for many police departments, big and small. Some police departments don't even know what VICAP is or have never heard, like me, of the Highway Serial Killings Initiative. The FBI program today is all about getting out there, doing the training of analysts and detectives. Here's what the FBI offers. Here's how you avail yourself of it. Here are the success stories. And then even telling them where grant money is available. In major cases, like the very case that kicked off the Highway Serial Killings Initiative way back in 2003 out of Oklahoma, sometimes there's a major case designation where the FBI comes in and says, look, we'll do some of this for you. You've got multiple deaths that look like serial killings. We'll come in right now and sit alongside you and get this data loaded for you. That's what happened in Oklahoma. In 2003, it was actually a woman by the name of Terry Turner in the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation who kept telling her higher-ups, hey, we've got like multiple victims, 8, 9, 10 women missing from Oklahoma who've turned up dead in other states. And they're linked to truck stops, last seen at truck stops, known sex workers. What are we doing about this? And it took her kind of pounding her fist on the desk for the guys in charge to go, okay, what are you screaming about? She ended up saying, look, I need to organize a national meeting of detectives who are experiencing similar crimes, and let's invite them here. And they said, okay. She expected maybe 20 detectives from across the country. 60 detectives showed up, all with similar crimes. She then almost shamed the FBI into showing up. And they did. And they said, yeah, you have met the criteria for serial killing, and we're going to come in and help.
Well, I'm reading the introduction of your book. You were writing about learning about this initiative, and you say that you came to grasp that hundreds of murders had been committed along our nation's highway, and many of those homicides were connected, and that, according to the Bureau, in most cases of highway homicide, long-haul truckers are responsible. Tell us a little bit more about what you decided to do to learn more, because usually, I'm doing a case review and it involves somebody who worked in the FBI who worked this type of violation, who's telling us what they did. This is what you're doing also, but you did this after you were in the FBI. You did this recently, and it really gives us a behind the scenes look at the lifestyle of a long haul truck driver. So why don't you do kind of like a case review and tell us more about the time that you spent with a long haul driver and the vulnerabilities both for the driver and for the women that he came across that would get them in a situation where they could come face to face with a serial killer.
Yeah, I did kind of do this backwards, didn't I? It's funny, in my FBI career, I kind of prided myself on knowing the various nooks and crannies of the FBI, largely because I served as an inspector and then chief inspector under Director Robert Mueller. And that got me, of course, into every field office and the LEGATs and the programs at headquarters, often that many FBI employees never even become aware of. So when I heard about this initiative, I said, well, that's something I never encountered. I got to learn more about this. And I started looking around for a driver, a long hauler who might be amenable to having me and tolerating me in his big rig for several days as we drove over 2,000 miles across the country. And I found one. I found a young guy in his 20s who had actually graduated from the Culinary Institute of America. He was a chef, but he wanted to make even more money. So he became this long-haul trucker. Riding with him was an eye-opening experience, in part because it helped me kind of become that behavioral analyst. By that, I mean, I was watching a young guy who was smart. He was a flatbedder. He was engaged with his load and with people. And the high-tech nature of today's trucking, Jerry, makes it much harder to be a serial killer trucker. Why do I say that? Because you're electronically tracked today in most trucking companies. Your owner, your company knows where you are. They have a camera looking in and out of your truck cab. They can see the traffic jam that you're in, for example. They know the weather conditions. That helped me figure out which kind of trucking might be more likely to produce a killer. That clearly is not the corporate high-tech trucker, although there are exceptions in the FBI's caseload. My theory is that we're talking about independent drivers, owner-operators for some of them, who don't have that high-tech connection, aren't constantly monitored. There's also cases in the FBI's caseload involving truckers who simply switched out with another trucker so that the company thinks it's Joe delivering that load today, but it's Jim. And Jim's doing some bad things. They may never figure out that Jim has switched out with Joe. There's also cases where truckers defeat the system by doing this on their mandatory, federally mandated downtime. Often on weekends, they need 36 hours of federally mandated rest. Well, that's where some truckers do their killing. They park their truck at a truck stop. They rent a car or take an Uber. They engage with a trafficked woman, and they do their killing off the truck site. So they're often at a kind of a low rent motel or massage parlor.
I know we've said this before, but I just want to say it again, that it's such a relief to be able to say, definitely out of respect for long haul truck drivers, that we are talking about a very small subset, and that we really don't need to be concerned that we have a roving band of serial killers in every tractor trailer that's on our highway. I do want to, and you've said it, and I do want to stress it again, but who are these men? You posed the question before, what came first? Obviously, there's something wrong at the beginning that caused them to get into this type of lifestyle, especially one where it is isolating and they may be away from family or they may not even have family. And this is all they have in their life.
For sure. In fact, I think it's important to say that these are not unique serial killers. By that, I mean the behavioral analysts will tell you a serial killer, there's very little differentiation in terms of how they are made, how they come to be. So the fact that many of them, in terms of roadside killings, happen to be serial killers does not mean there's some newfangled way to think about serial killings. When you dig deeply into these backgrounds of these men, you find some of the same horrors that you find in other serial killing cases. By that, I mean really brutal childhoods, often physically abused, beaten. And again, I want to emphasize, I'm not a behavioral scientist, but there's often abuse by the mother figure or some form of resentment against a mother figure, either for abandonment, abuse, or not doing something to change the environment. And that often gets projected onto the female victims they choose later in life.
You know what? I just was thinking that victimology, that personality description that you just gave for the trucker, that background, that terrible, tragic upbringing is the same upbringing that causes many of their victims, many of the women that we're talking about getting into sex work.
It's ironic. Your point is well taken that there is some irony here that there may be, we talk about commonalities amongst the killers. We talk about commonalities amongst the victims. And what you've just raised is the potential for commonalities between the victim and the trucker in terms of how they grew up. It could very well be that that's what we're looking at here. The one key difference, and there's many differences I see there, is that the sex trafficked victims are seeking some form of affection in a male figure, often when they're pimp controlled. I get deep into this in the academic studies with Dr. Williamson. Not all sex trafficked women are pimp controlled. There's 3 different kinds of work styles identified by Dr. Williamson. One is pimp controlled. The other is what they call renegades, who often do this on their own or with a friend without pimp control. And then there's outright outlaws. That's the third category, who are actually in it for criminal activity, meaning they're never going to have sex with a client. They're going to rip the guy off. They're going in there maybe pretending that they're going to have sex for money, but they're taking the money or they're taking something else and running. Those are outlaws. Those can be very dangerous as well. I get deep into the question of who is more likely, just as I talked about which kind of trucker might be more prone to killing. Was it the flatbedder? Is it the dry van guy? Is it the guy who drives what they call a reefer, a refrigerated truck? The hazmat guy, which is highly trained? And then I talk about, well, which victim, which sex trafficked woman is more likely to fall prey to a killing? And we get into this in a way where I look at the pimp controlled. This may sound strange, but as abusive as a pimp-controlled life can be, still that means you have somebody watching you almost 24/7, either the pimp himself or who they call the bottom, which is kind of the pimp's deputy girl, who's the senior girl in the stable. I learned all this lingo, and it's in the book. There's actually a language and vernacular like stable and shorty. It's all in there in the book. But who's more likely to be victimized? And really, I think the pimp-controlled situation, with all its monitoring, ironically, just like the corporate trucker who's highly monitored, is more likely not to be a killer. I think the pimp-controlled woman is less likely to fall prey and become a victim, because even the trucker knows there's a pimp out there somewhere looking at this scenario. It's fascinating, and it's something that the FBI's BAU-4, that's where this initiative sits, in Behavioral Analysis Unit number 4 at Quantico. They look at all of these questions.
Why don't we go through the life of either one of these women as a victim or one of these truckers as the subject and really get a good understanding of who gets involved in a highway serial killer incident?
Peppered throughout the book, Jerry, are at least a dozen real live cases, often the worst of the worst, often involving FBI involvement in some way or another, either active investigation involvement or the assistance of the behavioral analysis units. I want to pick just a couple that I think kind of illustrate this and even have some differences amongst them, but they've got some FBI involvement that's significant. In one of the cases, this is a real victim pool, I'll call it, and that is Indian reservations, what the FBI refers to as Indian country, native indigenous tribes. You want to talk about vulnerable. Throughout these cases, victims often have no one speaking for them. The family has long ago lost track of them, became adamant that the constant drug abuse, the bailing out of jail, all of that, the bad boyfriends was just enough. And to survive themselves, the family members, I'm told by experts, often create a distance there. So by the time this young lady is missing, the family doesn't know where they've been or even that they're missing. And so there's no one to champion the cause for them or speak for them. And I hope in a way that this book does that. One of those victims I talk about in the book is Casey Jo Pipestem from Oklahoma, one of the earlier cases. She was a member of the Seminole Indian tribe in Oklahoma. Her parents were not in the picture to the point where she got moved to some relatives and kept bouncing around from Oklahoma City to way out in the rural areas on a tribal reservation, raised by aunts and grandmas. She ended up at a very early age being trafficked and into drugs. By the time she was just 19 years old, her body was discovered not in Oklahoma, but outside of Grapevine, Texas. She had been trafficked to truckers by a pimp who controlled other women as well. The FBI entered into this picture in a pretty big way. Ultimately, while this case was worked for years with an outstanding detective in Grapevine, Texas, named Larry Hallmark, and they could just not get their hands on the killer, they decided, hey, while we're doing this, let's bring to justice the guy who trafficked Casey Jo Pipestem and these other girls, one as young as 13 years old. And they did that. And these were federal crimes. So some of your listeners might say, hey, is there a federal jurisdiction here? Yeah, the interstate trafficking aspect of this case brought federal charges investigated by the FBI. And an FBI agent testified in a trial of the pimp, whose name was Kelvin Scott. He was just 25 years old himself. And the FBI's agent testimony at his trial was really disturbing and compelling, talking about this particular 13-year-old victim who was trafficked with Casey, who had been addicted to drugs as a strategy. That's often a pimp strategy, right? You need to get the drugs from me. You need the money to get the drugs from me. You got to sell your body for me. And this young lady was self-mutilating. She had mental health issues. All of this came out in court through the testimony of an FBI agent. I can move on to another case where the FBI was involved, and that's this case we've already discussed, Robert Ben Rhodes, who was pulled over by an Arizona state trooper and had a naked woman shackled in the back of his rig. That began a whole unraveling of the life of Robert Ben Rhodes and the fact that he was good for as many as 50 murders. This last victim I talked about of Robert Ben Rhodes, Regina Walters, who was found in that abandoned farmhouse in Illinois, that crime scene allowed an FBI agent to find that kind of victimology, that crime scene signature that led to connections to other cases. What was the crime scene signature found by the FBI agent? In Regina's case, it was the fact that her pubic hair had been shaved prior to death. That plus other indications linked her death and the style of her death to other unsolved cases around the country linked to Robert Ben Rhodes. You can see where the details matter and the assistance of the FBI matters across jurisdictions for sure. There's another case that illustrates another kind of FBI assistance, which isn't so much investigative, but also preparing a detective or police officer to do a very important suspect interview, right? Often for a detective, this may be the only serial killing case in his or her entire career. Maybe never, ever have they touched even a homicide case in some cases, let alone a serial killer case. So you've got one crack sometimes at that interview to get the confession. The behavioral analysis folks will come in, as they did in another case, because it actually was the Casey Jo Pipestem case in Grapevine, Texas. What they discovered was that the suspect in that case was good for many other murders as well. In fact, he confessed. The killer of Casey Jo Pipestem ultimately confessed to 30 murders. It was the FBI that prepared Detective Larry Hallmark to interview the suspect, John Williams, and get it right. And it worked. There was a confession there. And in fact, it was interesting. The killer, John Williams, was asked repeatedly about Casey Jo. He was showing pictures of Casey, and he said, think about this, Jerry. You've killed so many people and seen so many women that you can't remember a particular face when it's shown to you.
It's horrific to think about that. You
Yeah,
can't remember.
Yeah. And then finally, with help from the FBI's behavioral folks, the detective went to Casey Joe's family and said, look, I appreciate the photo you've given me, but might you have any photos of how she might have been dressed if she were out there on the streets working? And they did have some different photos with different clothing. Once those photos were shown to John Williams, everything clicked. The light bulb went on. He said, oh, that's Little Bit. That was a cue phrase because the detective knew that Casey Joe had a tattoo of the words Little Bit on her arm. Those photos did it, and the help from the BAU helped solve that case because they showed the killer how this woman would have been dressed at the time. This guy, Williams, later retracted. Your listeners are savvy enough to know that a confession does not always mean a conviction. A confession is nice, but you then have to build your case. It took 10 years to build the case and finally convict Williams of the death of Casey Joe Pipestem. And that's the frustration in so many of these cases. You know this guy's done multiple killings, but you can't get him on every single one. You get him on what you can. And that's what happened in the case of John Williams and Casey Joe Pipestem.
So even though you have a guy that you believe is responsible for a number, many killings, the fact that you can at least put him away for 1 or 2 or 3 of these has to be satisfying enough, because that is the main thing, is to get him locked up so that he can't do this again.
Yeah, that's the key to getting around this career frustration that I've sensed in so many of these agents and analysts is that, look, we can't get them on everything we think that they're responsible for. But there's another kind of frustration that comes in here, which is there's an excitement level that develops when there's a suspect linked to one of these deaths. The excitement comes from, oh, this could be the guy who also did X, Y, and Z. And maybe he did those cases because this looks kind of similar. And then you discover he's got an alibi for these other cases. He was on the other side of the country, or we can't put him there, or he says, absolutely not. I was never there. It bears out truthfully. So you have this kind of roller coaster of professional frustration. I thought we had him on 5 of these and he wasn't there. And it hammers home to me, Jerry, the fact that there are still these unsolved cases, hundreds of them. Of the 850 in the database, about 200 are considered active and pending, unsolved. That's a tremendous frustration.
Yeah, I really get a good understanding of this FBI highway serial killer initiative as I was reading and going through all of the many yellow underlined parts of your book. One of the things talks about what you just talked about, the commonalities that connect the dots that form a line that points to a serial killer.
Yeah, what's really neat here that I experienced in writing this book was that the victims who can't speak anymore because they're deceased finally can actually speak through their death. Their crime scene can actually point to their killer. They can actually figuratively say to the law enforcement, this is who killed me, because their crime scene, their body, their victimization somehow contains the clues. That's so important for the behavioral analysis folks who lead this program. I'm fascinated by the dedication of these BAU analysts because they don't just rely on the data coming into the system from police departments, because as we've discussed, often police departments simply don't enter the data, even though the unit is going around the country trying to preach this gospel. What the analysts do every morning, they start their day checking the news, checking police reports nationally, and looking for something that catches their attention. Hey, here was a murder. This was near a highway. And they'll pick up the phone and they'll call that police department and say, hey, what's going on? How can we help? Do you need help entering this data? It's not just passive receipt of data. It is actively seeking it out.
That's fascinating. And I guess that's the analytical part of their job. So we're talking about the clues that help to solve these type of cases. Could you go through some of those commonalities again?
Absolutely. This is coming directly from the crime analyst who heads up the initiative at the FBI. This is her quote: dump sites, weapons used, bindings used, the place or position in which the victim's body was found. Was the body in water, a culvert? Was the body mutilated or sexually abused? Catherine Devane recited the commonalities assessed by crime analysts across a spectrum of murders, commonalities that connect the dots, that form a line that points to a serial killer.
So the work that they do is highly analytical for them to take a look at all of these things and try to connect those dots.
Yeah, indeed. This is why it's so important for the police departments to fill out and answer all the questions on the Highway Serial Killing Initiative form, because these details matter. It's also, Jerry, a lesson here on why leaks of pending investigations can be so brutal to the outcome of a case. Because if it gets out into the public that victims were taped with duct tape across the mouth, that can lead to a copycat crime. And it can cause great confusion among the law enforcement community because they'll think, hey, this looks like the same guy, and it's not. So that's why this kind of cone of secrecy needs to exist around the details of a murder.
We talked a little bit before we started this recording. I mentioned to you that when I first thought about the Serial Killer Highway Initiative, I was picturing truck stops where you see in the movies or on TV shows that you have all of these sex workers soliciting the truck drivers. I take it that still happens today, and that's how they get connected to these women who could possibly end up being victims of a serial killer.
I'm glad you asked that question because the answer is a bit more complicated. Just as long-haul trucking has become high-tech and technology is involved in trucking today, so is technology involved in peddling sex to truckers. What I mean by that is, yes, there are still what the industry calls lot lizards. I know that's a derogatory term, but even the girls call themselves lot lizards, those who work literally physically in the truck stop area. But it also applies to those who are around and servicing truckers, or as ads will say on the internet, who are trucker friendly. And I crossed the country in a big rig. I made an effort in certain locales to look up known sites on the internet where women will traffic themselves to truckers, and they'll use the term trucker friendly. But here's the thing on why it's diminished at the truck stop and why people might logically think, well, since I see less women walking around truck stops, there must be less of a problem. And I would assert, and the experts tell me, that it's even a greater problem today because the internet has put this whole problem on steroids. What I mean by that is now the adjacent motel, the rent by the hour motels, the adjacent massage parlors, and boy, these seem to be proliferating near truck stops. That's where a lot of this occurs. And it's a far more dangerous environment for the woman because it means that while there's some relative safety in the truck stop environment, and I emphasize relative safety, because you could scream and kick and eventually somebody might hear you inside that cab in trouble. Once you get that trucker in a motel room, one-on-one, if he's intent on hurting or killing you, there's little to be done about it. This online aspect comes out in another way, which is why so many people need to be aware of this problem. And that is a couple of things. First, I went into this research with, I will admit, a prejudice or a bias. I thought certainly none of the women, people, girls I know in my circle of family and friends that could ever fall victim to this life. I was dead wrong. This woman that I speak to in the book, whose alias is Hannah, a white girl with 1 year of college, blue eyes. It happened to her in a horrible, horrible way. She was trafficked to truckers at multiple times in her life. But the signs were there. The trauma before, in her case, age 11, a broken family, drug use early on, bad boyfriends exploiting her. It happened. What does that have to do with online? Well, she was in part advertised online, and she and others have told me the advertising is happening online. Online is where it's at. Dr. Rose Sepowitz at Arizona State University actually has done a huge body of research involving advertising underage girls online for sex. She had a grant to study that specifically at the Super Bowl. She did it several years ago at the Meadowlands in New Jersey at the Super Bowl, identifying the kind of language using algorithms to identify certain language in ads that pointed to an underage victim being trafficked. Fascinating study. Just like all of society is moving online, and who knows what artificial intelligence will bring to this problem. It will be good and bad, I believe, but it's going online. So less physical presence by trafficked victims at the truck stops does not mean that the problem has lessened.
Yeah, I can understand that when it comes to the human trafficking part. And I have been trying to get a retired female agent who spent her career working on human trafficking to come do a case review on the show. And I've scheduled some, and for some reason or not, they have fallen through. But I really want to do that. I'll come back to my point about female because you bring it up in your book too. But in talking about the online stuff, that may be the case for human trafficking. But when we're talking about the Highway Serial Killer Initiative, most of those men are not contacting these women to have sex. They just want to kill someone, right?
Good question. As the behavioral analysts have pointed out to me, there's those two kinds of killers, right? There's the trucker who wants to have sex and is interested in power and control and torturing and enjoys a long process before the murder takes place. And that process includes sex. And there's the second category of killer trucker who's all about just killing. And that guy kills quickly.
And that guy needs to get that woman in his truck. The ones that want to torture and bind and keep them kind of as slaves, they don't need to hook up with them in the hotel room. They need to get them in their truck.
Good point. Almost always the case for that category of killer because he controls his environment best in the truck. But there have been cases. There's one case where it happened in a motel room, number one. Number two, there was a case where the abduction occurred in the woman's car. He ended up convincing her to drive him in her car to a place to have sex. And she ended up a victim. So it happens, but it's rare. You're right. The truck is the ultimate controlled domain for the killer.
Going back to my woman thing, you had noted in your book, and you had said this during this interview, that many of the people who investigate human trafficking and highway serial killers are women. Did you find out why that is, or do you have your own theory, or did someone tell you their thoughts about that?
Yeah, I do have a theory on this, and no one has outright expressed it to me, but I think to me it's pretty obvious, which is, first, I go back to Terry Turner, that Oklahoma State analyst who first generated the Highway Serial Killings Initiative in the FBI through her passionate dedication. She literally called these victims, quote, her girls. There was a connection here. I think we still live in a society, this may not be pleasant, but it's reality, where the champions of women are often women, and particularly victims who can't speak for themselves because they're dead or society doesn't value them. I do think that women often are the ones who lead this. Look at the two professors that I talked to, Celia Williamson and Dominique Rose-Sepowitz. They are considered the leaders in research and street work here, both women. Then look at who's leading the FBI, Highway Serial Killings Initiative, a woman. I'm a trained investigator. When I see evidence, I can draw a conclusion. And it just seems to me that the leaders in these fields are indeed female.
I think we have covered so many interesting topics and facts about this initiative, and I really appreciate you coming here to talk to us about it. I would love to be able to follow up with this conversation with talking to one of those women who have worked in the field investigating and researching this phenomenon. So thank you for coming. I've been flipping through the book, thinking of things that I wanted to ask you. The book is full of just so many interesting things, but I just want to go back to the very beginning. In your epilogue, you say that this book started as an interest in the FBI's Highway Serial Killers Initiative, but quickly became a quest to understand the cultures beneath the killings. Do you understand it now?
I have a much greater grasp, and the whole book is my effort to tell Americans really what's going on in three subcultures that we seldom have any insight into. And that's, of course, the sex trafficking culture, the trucker culture, and the crime analyst culture. I hope that I did an effective job of sharing this with folks. And I remind people that if you think it can't happen to someone in your family, I say this near the end of the book, this whole thing in terms of recruitment of young women is happening online. So if you think, well, I've got a handle on my daughter's friends, I kind of know what she's doing online, I would suggest to you that you don't, because the recruitment process and grooming process is happening earlier and earlier and online. And it's not some stranger. We hear about movies and cases of stranger abduction, and some young lady or boy is grabbed and then trafficked That happens in relatively rare cases. What happens far more often is that someone on the fringe of your kid's friend group, some boyfriend of some girl twice removed from a friend of your daughter, is online, and maybe the marijuana joint that's entering the picture is coming from him. And that's where the recruitment is happening. And you've got to be aware of that if you're a parent.
Yeah, so here we are all thinking that the most horrific and dangerous thing about someone being involved in sex work was being killed or harmed by a single client or their pimp, when we weren't even aware of the fact that they could also be hunted down and targeted by quote unquote serial killers. And you said it to us before. You told us the facts before that there were at least 25 truckers doing prison time for serial murder right now.
That's true. 450 additional truckers being looked at as killing suspects, and about 200 pending active cases that are unsolved.
All right. Well, I am going to give you your last word at the very end. We're going to go through my standard questions. But my last word on this topic is just to remind everyone, we are not talking about all truckers. And there's another fact in your book. You say that 72% of this country's freight is transported through trucks. We need trucks. We need truckers. We're only talking about a certain subset.
Oh, for sure. One of the things I learned, Jerry, and I talk about the economics of trucking, is how fascinating long-haul trucking actually is and how essential it is to our economy. While I was out riding, we carried loads involving gypsum or drywall. I mean, if you live in a house or work in an office, you're surrounded by gypsum, drywall, and it's critical to the housing industry. I was riding after the COVID break where housing, building, construction stopped, and now suddenly the demand was turned back on. I rode with loads of lumber for the housing industry, flooring specifically. I rode with loads of aluminum that were being used in a DoD contracting facility to make ammunition for the U.S. military. You know, it did all of that. What an eye-opening experience to understand how essential trucking is to our economy.
Although I already asked you in episode 228 about when and why you joined the FBI, I thought I would do it again because the audience for an episode about national security and counterintelligence may not be the same listener who's going to listen to this episode. So let me ask you again, why and when did you join the FBI?
I was raised in a family where there was clear demarcation between right and wrong, justice or injustice. That's kind of where I grew up. When I was 11 years old, Jerry, I wrote a letter to the special agent in charge of the FBI in New Haven, near where I was living. And I said, I'm 11 years old. I want to be an FBI agent. And I'll never forget that. He wrote back and he said, here's what you need to do, grade-wise, physical-wise. Get back to me in 15 years. I may even still have that letter somewhere. So it was growing up in Southern Connecticut where we were part of the New York media market. I was watching on news as a kid out of New York, the FBI taking down mob families, for example. And I thought, these people, these guys and gals are using their brains to take down organized crime. That's pretty cool. I developed that interest, ultimately went to law school with the goal of someday becoming an FBI agent.
Talking about the news, you're watching the news and monitoring the news at a young age, but now you're doing it as a post-FBI second career. So even though I've read your bio at the beginning of the episode, so they have an idea what you did in the FBI, let's spend a little bit of time talking about your new career as a commentator on the news and as an author, because this is your second book. Are you planning on writing more?
You know, it's funny. I've told my wife in the course of writing this very difficult book, much more difficult than writing my first one, that I'll never do this again. And I've already started thinking about, well, if I do, what would that be about? So I don't know the answer to that. I know that I enjoy writing. I write a regular column for MSNBC Daily online. So I enjoy it. We'll see. If I can communicate something that's worthy of communicating, I might do it. I am exclusive in terms of my television commentary. I am a national security contributor exclusively to NBC and MSNBC. I'm in my 7th year of doing that, Jerry. It's gone very fast. I'll be honest with you, it hasn't been pleasant. As you all know, these are unpleasant times in our country. And I find that as hard as I try to be the objective national security guy, I get lumped into partisan politics and polarization of our society, where people only watch one news network or assume that other network is evil. I find that really unpleasant, and I do my best to explain how the FBI works. I'm honest. Sometimes the FBI screws up, and when they do, they're on the front page of the newspaper, and I address that openly and honestly as well. I'm hopeful that in a small way, the work that I do on television might educate more about the FBI, about national security threats, and that's what I try to deal in straight up. If other networks would have me, I'd be happy to appear there as well.
Well, that is great to hear. As you know, I was the spokesperson and the media rep for Philadelphia when I retired, and then I worked for 7 years as a media director for SEPTA, which is the Philadelphia Public Transportation System. So I am always constantly getting requests from all the different news stations and newspapers about coming on to talk about current events. And I turn them down because I don't want to get involved in that toxic atmosphere. I feel kind of dedicated now to just letting these stories that I am so grateful that retired agents are willing to share with me and the audience. I'm just going to let these stories speak for themselves, speak for the FBI. But I certainly admire you and those other retired agents, whether I agree with them or not, willing to go out there and take the punches because it is a toxic environment to be out there talking about anything that people could convey as being your own personal politics, whether you're just trying to tell the truth or not. I do think that one of the great things about your opportunity to be on national news is that you do have a platform. And the fact that you've written this book, Long Haul, Hunting the Highway Serial Killers, is an opportunity for people to learn more about something they probably haven't ever thought about. You have a good, solid platform, and it's really great that you're using it to provide information to the public with your books. I welcome that. I hope you keep writing.
Thanks a lot, Jerry. Yeah, there's totally nothing partisan or political in this book. It doesn't matter what TV network you watch or what party you are. There's nothing partisan about the problem of human sex trafficking and the immediacy of the problem on our nation's highways and the study of how young women mostly fall prey to sex trafficking and ultimately, unfortunately, in huge numbers, fall prey to death at the hands of serial killers. Long-haul trucking has always been a mystery to me. I don't understand how it works, what goes on inside that cab, who's in that truck behind me on the highway. This book is for you. If you've been fascinated by the almost formulaic way that young people can fall into trafficking and how that works at a street and truck stop level, then this book is for you. And if you're one of those true crime aficionados who just loves to understand how criminal analysis works and hunting serial killers works, then this book is for you as well.
I will put a link to your book where it can be purchased in the show notes for this episode. I will also add it to my FBI reading resource, which is a colorful list of more than 80 books now. And your first book is on there too, for anybody who's looking for books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on FBI Retired Case File Review. So thank you, Frank, for coming back for the second time. When you get that third book, we'll have you back for a third time.
I'm grateful for the discussion, Jerry. Thank you.
I like to give my guests the last word. So what do you want to say?
I thoroughly respect and understand the approach you've decided to take. Believe me, I do. And your use of the word toxic, I think, is accurate, unfortunately. But you're doing as much a service, if not more, than I may be doing in my corner of the world on national television. Because like you said, you're simply opening case files and helping people understand the work of the FBI in a completely nonpartisan way. We need more of that. I think, quite frankly, the FBI, while they're doing an increasingly good job of marketing the brand in terms of their success stories in things like human trafficking, crimes against children, fraud, public corruption, I think they can do it even more because that's what the public needs right now.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find photos of Frank Figliuzzi and other case-related images, plus lots of FBI articles about VICAP and the Highway Serial Killers Initiative. There is, of course, an image of the book cover for Frank's new book, Long Haul: Hunting the Highway Serial Killers, and a link for where you can pick up a copy. There are also links to other FBI Retired Case File Review episodes about the Highway Serial Killings Initiative, VICAP, and related topics. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.